here has been following our legal trends report for a couple years? Oh, everyone, yes, give it up for an amazing report. Also designed beautifully. Can we give it up for the design behind this report? Yeah, let's get loud, team, we're here. So I think my one and only George is ready to go. I think everyone has found a seat. So get ready and sit in, because it's going to be an amazing presentation. So without further ado, I'd love to bring up to the stage George Psiharis.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Can't really beat the lead up of the inimitable Jesse. Let's hear a round of applause for him as he's keeping the energy level ramped up. Also super appreciative of the opening keynote from the one and only Jack Newton. Not bad, right? Not bad, pretty good way to start the day. As Jesse mentioned, we're here to follow up on some of the concepts that Jack opened up with and presented as part of the keynote today, and that is a deep dive review of an annual publication that we produce at Clio called the Legal Trends Report. For those of you that I have not had the opportunity to meet in the past, my name is George, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at Clio. I get to do a large variety of things that I'm very excited about as part of this job, but none of them excite me quite as much as our annual opportunity to put together and publish this report. I am passionate about building data-driven cultures in organizations, in ecosystems, and if we can, in the profession as a whole. And I'd like to invite everyone to join me in taking one giant leap further toward becoming a data-driven lawyer or legal professional today. And I hope you're excited to join us for that. So the talk has a pretty simple agenda. I'd like to open up with a few thoughts on the landscape that we're embracing in legal and expanding on some of the points that Jack opened up with this morning. From there, I'll dive into the data review and go into what I think the top insights of the many expansive insights we've produced this year are from the Legal Trends Report. And then finally, I'd like to conclude, as I always prefer to, with some key lessons and takeaways. All the kind of big picture thinking in the insight review doesn't matter a lot if we're not able to translate that into everyday things we can do in our legal practices or advise others to do. So that's what I'm going to plan to cover today. Before we begin, some pro tips on this talk. This is a data-heavy review that I typically prepare, and I've had the opportunity actually to present across the country. That is a heavy lift. It's a lot of stuff. I'm excited about it. I know it's a lot to take in, so I'm going to move fast as quickly as I can. But a couple of things I've noticed. One, folks always scramble to take down the specific data points from the presentation. Don't worry about doing that. You'll all get access to the report free. It's going to be delivered to you by email and in the conference app. Instead, try to focus on absorbing the insights we walk through and some of the key takeaways. The second thing is, I think journeying through some of the learnings we've had can be an uncomfortable experience for a lot of practitioners and almost come across as like a bad news story. Here's all the things we suck at. That is not what I want people to take away from the talk today, right? It's very easy and only human to fall into that mindset. What I'd strongly prefer is that we look at these as insights that power us to do amazing things. They really are the book of facts that once we internalize them can have us change the game in really, really important ways. And if you can find a way to do that as we buckle up and settle in, I think it'd be really, really beneficial for enjoying the talk today. And to kind of get us into a bit of what might be described as a growth mindset, I'd like to borrow a quote from Simon Sinek, who's a New York Times bestselling author, a very popular TED Talk entitled Start With Why. And among his most famous quotes are, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And he perennially gives the example, for instance, of Apple and their theme of think differently. I'm technically not selling you anything in terms of the report today. It is available for free, so I'm not asking you to buy it, but I am kind of asking you to buy into a certain way of thinking. And to embody this mindset, I thought we could begin by having a look at what's happening in the legal services landscape in 2018. And there's no better way to dive into that, I think, than some very recent news that's still hot off the presses that should inform the way that we think about actioning many of the things Jack opened up with today in his keynote. So I'm going to walk through some news that jumped out to me over the course of the year in leading into why all this insights business and the Legal Trends Report matters. The first area and hotbed of activity is continued investment in automated legal services. Everyone's favorite example, of course, is LegalZoom. Well, the folks at LegalZoom this year announced a $500 million investment in a secondary round. And in doing so, also announced a very interesting strategic partnership with a company called Clause. Is anyone familiar with Clause? They were formerly branded as Clause.io. Not a lot of folks. They're doing some very interesting work using blockchain technology to develop smart contracts that basically automate. They renew themselves, they automatically update, in ways that we haven't really seen before, and are a really interesting fit for a provider like LegalZoom, who seeks to go for automation in terms of legal process. A second really interesting hotbed of activity that really picked up in the second half of the year were what I call Big Four accounting firms and alternative business structures. So for those not familiar, unlike the legal space where we have a very fragmented set of providers, the accounting space has four dominant firms that are often referred to as the Big Four. Those are companies like Deloitte, KPMG, Ernst & Young, who rebranded as EY, and PwC. In the United Kingdom, we've started to see deregulation of ownership rules, frequently referred to as alternative business structures or alternative legal service providers, where non-lawyers can own and operate certain types of law firms. What we've then started to see is these Big Four accounting shops acquire either part or whole alternative legal service providers and roll their offerings into the consulting and tax advice and accounting offerings that they have, so that they own more of the wallet share, so to speak, that is going to the same book of clients. Instead of referring someone out to a lawyer, why don't I just own that firm and pocket that revenue? And we've seen that really, really heat up in the second half of this year. And a third example I'll point to is Silicon Valley, known and regarded largely as the hotbed of innovation, making a massive bet. Andreessen Horowitz, which is arguably the most highly regarded firm in the VC world in San Francisco, led a round of $65 million in a company called Atrium Law. Atrium is a really revolutionary idea. They have two arms, a technology arm that focuses on using machine learning to automate processes in legal, and a legal services arm where lawyers are uniquely licensed to use that technology to provide their services. So what do each of these three examples have in common? The first is the looks on your faces. You all look like you're staring at this. And the psychologists tend to call that a threat response. Lawyers hear this stuff, and they're like, oh shit, this is not good. We're finally going to get replaced. Richard Susskind was right. It's the end of lawyers. Just telling it how it is. The second thing is this gap between lawyers and clients that we described. I think each of these vendors has uniquely understood and is finding a way to work around bridging the expectation gap that we see between lawyers and clients in the way that we opened up with today. And then finally, I think that they have all identified a different segment of kind of the iceberg that Jack talked about and are taking unique approaches. So what's common in them is that they're focused. What's uncommon is that they're tackling different parts of the market. LegalZoom, I think, is taking a square look at the mass market and that automated legal services, making things democratized and approachable to everyone. With Atrium, I think we have a targeted offering that goes after mid-market, where we're going for a corporate client, but one that wants to move fast and do things a little bit differently. And finally, the Big Four accounting firms are not looking to make legal services approachable. They're looking to capture the $1,100 an hour that law firms that work with them are charging big corporate clients. And the bigger the price, the narrower the segment of the market as you look at any type of market, whether that's legal services or consumer goods. So I talked about not looking at this all as bad news, and I think this would be a very apropos moment for me to start talking about what's the good news. And this is where the mindset shift, I think, needs to happen. Each and every one of these examples, to me, shows technology wanting to fuse, evolve with the lawyer, not go around them or replace them. In each one of these cases, there is a very important and leading role that legal professionals need to play. They just can't continue doing things the same way that they've always done them. And I think if we embrace that mentality, we're standing on the cusp of this huge opportunity that we've talked about today. Here are some things maybe folks can think about. You might not consider yourself an early adopter, but you are. We estimate that there are about 1.5 million people employed by private legal practices in America. There are 1,500 in this conference and several hundred in this room right now. Not a lot of people starting to think this way and going through this transformation. As we mentioned already, the overall legal services market is likely to get larger, not smaller, as part of this transition. And we're also witnessing, through the Clio platform, through other examples, this explosion of tools that can do stuff, that can help us get better at all of these different things. What I think needs to bring this all together are the insights of how to deploy those tools. I have all this stuff I could be doing. How do I focus? How do I prioritize? How do I set goals and know if I'm achieving them? And this is why we produce the Legal Trends Report every year. It's unlike any other study that shows us the way and shows us some of the facts that we need to embrace in looking ahead and moving forward. As Jack mentioned earlier, we've expanded the scope of the report. In the previous 2 years, we've published primarily on inward-looking metrics related to law firms. We've returned with those, but have expanded the scope of the report to also look at consumer and lawyer behaviors when it comes time for a client to find a law firm, and when it comes time for a client to rate their law firm and to comment on customer satisfaction. So we've really broadened those areas of this report and the insights we can take out of them and take back to everyday practice. Very quickly, we rely on 3 data sources for accruing this information. One is Clio data, so our own customer base. Their data is anonymized and aggregated and published into many of the KPI-style benchmarks and hourly rates that we'll review today. We conduct an extensive law firm survey, and this year, more than ever before, we've conducted a very extensive consumer survey, much longer than any we've done in the past. OK, so that's the preamble. Now we're going to dive into the stuff I'd like everyone to take with them and to know. And we'll start with the firm-focused metrics. For those of us joining for the first time, I think there'll be some real eye-openers in this section. For those who've joined us before, I think you'll see reaffirmation of things that we've reported on in previous years. Before we begin, one of the reasons to embrace this benchmarking data is that we find lawyers struggle to set and measure goals. So in our lawyer survey, we asked how many people were very satisfied with their ability to set, attain, and measure goals for their business. And roughly 25% of people in these first 3 questions said they were very satisfied with their ability to do that. On the flip side, only 43% of respondents said they were interested in more accessible data insights, better reporting for their practice. So some work to do there. If there's one thing I die trying in this space, it's getting that last number up, getting lawyers to be data-driven and to think about embracing this stuff. We're making progress. We're not all the way there, and I think that presents a really compelling opportunity. So folks aren't super satisfied, mostly, with how they define success. But even so, how do they do it? So what are the things that people identified as the top things that they want to get better at or consider successful? The top 2 were increasing firm revenue and increasing efficiency of firm operations, followed by hiring more staff and improving client care and satisfaction. All pretty reasonable things, and I think stuff that most of us would nod our head at and say, sounds about right. If we scroll to the bottom of the list, I'm fascinated to see that growing one's client base and billing more hours are at the bottom of the pile. It's a little unintuitive for me because those are the top 2 things I would think someone would do in a primarily hourly-based legal services model to drive more revenue. So how do we get from wanting more revenue to not wanting to do any more things that drive revenue? Seems like a bit of a gap there. And here's how. Lawyers are already maxed out. People are already working extra hours. The overwhelming majority of lawyers said that they worked outside of regular business hours, and the top 2 reasons they cited were to catch up on work and because they believed it was necessary to succeed. So I personally believe that just throwing more work at this problem is not a tenable solution. People already feel like they're maxed out, overworked, doing many things. Clearly, it's a matter of working smarter instead of just working more or working harder. And I think that's something almost all of us could relate with. So this is why benchmark data plays such a vital role in letting us know how we're doing versus the rest of the crowd. And the first of those benchmarks that we publish every year is what we call the Billable Hour Index. So we're still predominantly hourly in our work in legal. And one of the areas in our survey we wanted to explore was what do lawyers think about when they're setting their hourly rates? Here are the top few reasons. Pressure from clients to get a better deal. My reputation, how pressing the timeline is for the case. And in 4th place, we had industry market rates. In 5th place, we had the value that my services provide. Personally, I'd expect to see market rates being one of the top things we think about when we price our services. The market sets the price. That's how capitalism works. So I'd expect to see that a bit higher. I'd expect to see people thinking about the value of their services over something like their reputation. So I found that a bit surprising as well. And what we saw at the bottom were things like the costs associated with running my law firm, and right at the bottom, my own personal cost of living. So this art form we're currently going through of setting rates isn't particularly data-inspired. Like, what are the data points you have? What are my costs of doing business and living? What are my goals and my targets? And what is the perceived value of my service versus the marketplace out there? And that's where these benchmarks can be so helpful. So for the year of 2018, we found that the overall average for an hour of billable work across the United States in legal for a lawyer was $267 per hour. For a non-lawyer, that average was $143 per hour. We also plot this over time to see, is it going up? Is it going down? How is it trending as a price point? And we also plot it against something called CPI, which is Consumer Price Index. CPI is kind of a measure of what you pay for everyday things, cost of living, basket of goods like food, clothing, shelter. So as much as you might look at this graph and think, okay, prices for legal services on an average are on a rise, they're kind of going on a rise similar to overall cost of living and keeping pace with that. Interestingly, the hourly rates for non-lawyers or for other types of fee earners in the firm have stayed flat versus increasing prices for a long time. And I think that's kind of an evidence of price pressure being applied to what clients are interested in paying for. Another benchmark we're able to publish is this data on state level. So if you want to identify what the rates are in your own state and compare, we could do two things. One is publish the actual rates. The other is the kind of important one. Going back to this concept of cost of living not being worked into the way that we're pricing our services, we can actually adjust them for the cost of living relative to each state. So for example, the highest reported rates we see are in New York State, where we have $325 per hour. But once we adjust for the higher cost of living, that's actually equivalent to $281 per hour. If we compare to Nevada, we have a base rate of $313 per hour, but due to a cheap cost of living, a lawyer there is relatively billing more for their time at $320 per hour, adjusted for cost of living. Really transformative to think about things in this way, but without the source data to look at and make a call, I don't think most of us would be in position to think about this in pricing our services, deciding where we're going to practice and where we're going to live, a new grad deciding where they're going to sit for the bar exam, all these kinds of things that are now made accessible by this data. We're also able to do the top 10 district metropolitan areas. So for the top 10 kind of metro areas in the States, we can see what the relative prices are. Coming in at the highest is New York City, $368 per hour, followed by Los Angeles and Chicago. If you want to see your town on there, just sign everybody up for Clio, and we'll be able to anonymize and aggregate that data in no time. OK, I'll move next into the section on law firm key performance indicators. Are people relatively familiar with the term KPI? Is that familiar? A few nodding heads. OK. These are measures of business health and success that almost any type of business can have, but depending on the way that the business works can be quite different. So every year, we, as part of the Legal Trends Report, publish 3 across the industry. Those are utilization rate, realization rate, and collection rate. And I'll explain each of them in some detail. Utilization rate is defined as how many hours out of the billable workday you put toward billable activity. So if I have 8 hours in my workday, and I put 4 hours toward billable work and record it, that's a utilization rate of 50%. Across the industry, using an estimate based on an 8-hour workday, we arrived at a 30% utilization rate for practicing legal professionals. Realization is the next step. This is where you take the value of that billable work and compare it to what ends up on an invoice that a client eventually sees. So that critical step where you kind of size up sticker shock, like, oh, I can't put all of this on there. They're never going to pay. This is the next kind of attrition point that happens, and that came in across the industry at 81%. And lastly, we have this critical step of collections, the collection rate. Of the stuff that I do put on bills and send out to clients, how much of that actually gets paid? So realization rate came in at 81% across the industry. Collection rate came in at 85% across the industry. Here's another way of maybe visualizing this. So if we start with an 8-hour workday, and we have that utilization rate of 30%, with this critical attrition point where that only turns into 2.4 billed hours. In the next step, it gets reduced to 1.9 hours that are realized. And finally, a total of 1.6 hours out of an 8-hour workday that you actually bill for, collect, and put cash in your bank account. This is the part where I need to remind everyone of the good news story. It's coming. Don't worry. It's in here. But people get taken aback by the utilization rate. That's obviously a place to start. It could be for one of 2 reasons or a combination of both. Not enough clients, too much time spent doing other stuff that's not billable. But I don't want to underscore the importance of the realization and collection rate steps either. So I had some fun and picked 2 very different practice areas, bankruptcy and government law, and compared hourly rates, so excluding any flat fee or alternative fee arrangement work. What happens to these rates if we put them through the realization and collection steps? So realization for bankruptcy law, hourly work was 74%, collection was 71%. On the government side, 96%, 98%, much higher. The rates that we started with in bankruptcy were $335 an hour. And by the time we put them through these attrition points, you end up at $176 per hour collected. On the government law side, we start much lower, $166 per hour, but actually come out with $156 per hour, almost the same rate, despite less than half to start with. So even though these rates might sound like less different, the utilization rate step is the big, flashpoint, they add up, and they make a meaningful impact to how the economics of a law firm's business work. So what goes on in this step? We asked a couple questions to surround this data about the why, kind of how and why things happen. 36% of lawyers reported discounting their rates in some way as part of this process, always or often. 38% of lawyers did so occasionally, or what we described as sometimes. In terms of why they do that, top reason was empathy for the client. The second was the client's ability to pay. The third was too much time was tracked in the first place. And a couple more on concern the client would object, and the quarter industry billing guidelines which apply in certain circumstances. So that's kind of what's going on in the law firm, and there's a lot of work to be done there, right? Like the way the business model is functioning right now, I would not describe as ideal or healthy. And make no mistake, dealing with this stuff day to day causes stress and makes it difficult and turns into this cycle where even more time gets put toward non-billable work because at the end of the day, you're a business owner, and typically a small business owner. 80% of law practices are firms of 1 to 10 attorneys. That gets us into part 3, which is insights on the client experience. So we walked through a few of these as part of the keynote, but this is where I think things start to turn around. If I looked here and came up empty for ideas, we'd be screwed. We'd nothing left to be done, no improvements to make. But the good news is there are a ton of low-hanging fruit here where we can optimize some technology spend, some focus, change mindset, and have tremendous impact. So the first step is understanding the gap between clients' emotions and lawyers' perception. We asked the same question, which I know is mean, but we did it a lot, so it's gonna keep happening, of the client and of the lawyer, and ask what emotions do you experience as you're looking for a lawyer in the first place? You're looking to hire a lawyer. The green bar here is the lawyer perception, and the blue bar is the client perception. So in some cases, lawyers nailed it. Anxiety, control, annoyance, and anger. They felt exactly when that was happening with their clients and were eerily close in the estimates in terms of the number of people reporting those numbers. In some others, though, there were some key differences, and there are a couple I'd like to highlight. Way more lawyers thought their clients were confused than clients thought they were confused. Interesting, don't really have an explanation for that one, other than people always think they're smarter than they are. Anyway, the next one, relief. Only 17% of lawyers guessed that their clients were feeling a sense of relief, yet the majority of clients reported feeling a sense of relief. Hang on to that one, that's really important. What are people looking for, if nothing else, but that feeling of relief? Someone's gonna help me. The other one I'll fast forward to is right at the end. Only 8% of lawyers thought their clients felt a sense of frustration. 40% of clients expressed a sense of frustration in hiring a lawyer. Relief versus frustration, right? How can we conquer this balance and get on the right side of it to much additive effect? And I think that takes us full circle back to this concept of an end-to-end client journey. There's so many steps along the way, whether that's this front-end piece of how people are searching for and looking to find a lawyer, or the tail-end piece of how they experience working with a law firm and what behaviors it drives after the fact that could be really essential to the way a law firm can choose to operate and be successful. So to start, I want to go to the front end of that, which is the legal consumer piece, and dive into that in a bit more detail. So the first step is assessing this latent legal services market. There are people who realize they have a legal issue and people who don't. There are people who realize they have a legal issue and hire a lawyer, and people who don't. And they're all different subcategories with a lot of complex thinking going on in that process. And this is what we endeavored to dive into. So 59% of consumers surveyed said they would consider using the law when faced with a legal problem. Keep in mind, that requires them to be aware of the fact that they have a legal problem, which is a separate issue. 57% of consumers reported having dealt with a life issue that could have been handled legally, but wasn't. That's over half of people saying, yeah, I probably could have used a lawyer, but whatever reason, I don't want to do it. So we asked, why do you want to do it? Like, what are the drawbacks? What are the things that prevent you from thinking about or realizing that you need a lawyer to help you? Number one, the benefits are not worth the money. Number two, although the benefits may justify the cost, still too much money. Number three, the overall final cost isn't clear. Kind of a recurring theme, cost, cost, cost. But there are others in here as well. There's the do-it-yourself crowd in the fourth spot. Not much I'm going to ask you to do with that crowd, you know. But then there are things like too overwhelming, too much trouble. I don't think I'd find a good lawyer. I wouldn't know what to do. They have this common theme of maybe I have the money or I see the cost and value, but it's just kind of hard. It's not good. At the very bottom, second to last, I want to point out that only 6% of people have said, I've had a bad experience in the past trying to resolve an issue legally. It's not like a lot of people are saying, I hated it so much that I'm not going to do it again. It's more like, I don't even know where to start. I don't know how to make this easy or approachable to myself, which is a key takeaway for me. And then, yeah, I don't know what's going on with the last one there, but keep doing what you're doing. So of those consumers who reported having an issue but not seeking legal help, what were the areas? We asked kind of what were the things, the types of practice areas that you had issues in that you chose to not hire a lawyer for. The most common were driving or traffic violations and family-related issues, followed by wills, estates, planning, and funerals. Debt and or bankruptcy rated pretty high as well. We can see a lot of stuff that can be fairly transactional or, I like to call B2C, business to consumer, as opposed to business law, are the areas where people either lack the sophistication, the funds, or the confidence to go and pursue legal advice. On the good news side, why did folks who hired lawyers hire them? What were the motivations for doing it? Almost a three-way tie at the top. I didn't think I could handle my issue without a lawyer. It was clear that a lawyer would be beneficial in my case. The issue was serious enough that I felt the need to hire a lawyer, and I found a lawyer that I trusted enough to hire. So clearly, when things get serious enough, people who have the means will go look for legal advice. So we took all of this data and did something that was really interesting, which is this driver analysis. This chart's a little complicated to interpret, so I'll do my best to explain it, or at least the point. On the left-hand side, we have this statistical correlation, so this impact on preference. There's a lot of stuff people said, but how much impact did it actually have in whether or not they got legal advice? On the other side, we have what percentage of our total consumer respondents actually said that. So not surprisingly, the strongest driver was, I enjoy handling legal issues myself. But only 22% of people said that, so they're a minority. If we go to the third spot, working with a lawyer seems overwhelming, was the third most powerful driver of avoiding a lawyer in the first place, and way more people, almost 40%, gave that response. So you can pick that out as something that's like a high leverage opportunity to take advantage of. This is one of the strongest drivers of people avoiding using a lawyer in the first place, is that it's too overwhelming, and there's a large chunk of the population out there that chose that response. And I think that's really, really crucial in terms of where to prioritize making adjustments. At the bottom of the list, all this cost stuff that we saw as highly reported or frequently chosen issues actually didn't have a ton of statistical correlation to someone's likelihood to avoid a lawyer. You can never know how much a lawyer will cost in total was a common complaint, but actually had no correlation with how likely someone was to go and find a lawyer or not. They complain about the cost, but they'll still do it if they need to. Very, very interesting and fascinating, and key to thinking about internalizing the client experience as part of this process. One final insight on the consumer buying journey section of the Legal Trends report this year. There's tons of evidence of consumers who don't hire still inquiring. One of everybody's favorite pet peeves. Do I charge for the initial consultation? Do I not? How do I know they're not just tire kicking? The problem is the client's going through the same brain damage on the other side. It's such a painful process for them too. I'm going through a moment of crisis, and I need to go talk to 4 different lawyers to see who gives me the best price, and like, who do I trust the most? I just don't want to deal with this right now. On the flip side, you've got legal professionals saying, I don't want to deal with this. Like, I need a way to vet my clients. And again, this serves as a really high leverage place where we can have impact. So just to quantify a few of those things. 65% of those who faced a legal problem in the past 2 years reported hiring a lawyer. 58% sought a consult with a lawyer they didn't hire. So even if they ended up hiring someone, at least 58% of them talked to more than one, or talked to folks and hired no one at all. And 68% communicated with a lawyer, so email, phone, maybe an in-person meeting, that they didn't hire. If we compare people who said that they preferred to hire a lawyer versus people who don't, it's not actually that different. Like, they're just as likely to go out and start asking questions and inquire whether they want to do it or not. The really important key step of this client journey is, what can we do to make this less taxing for both parties? I think there's some really interesting opportunities there. Okay. That applies a bookend to the consumers looking, sort of shopping for a lawyer, so to speak. What about this side of things on NPS and likelihood to recommend, and why is that so important? So the first section to look at is actually an insight from last year's Legal Trends report, and that is that we found 62% of consumers asked friends and family for recommendations when hiring a lawyer. This is primarily a referral-driven business. Like, that's the way this business works. When people are going through a moment of crisis, their first impulse is ask someone, do you know a lawyer? And if you can get that referral in that moment, that's the magic that drives the business model and begins a really high-value client experience. Of course, to know that, to kind of get a sense or a benchmark of whether or not people will refer your services, you have to ask them. So we asked law firms, do you ask for feedback? 37% said the truth, which was we don't regularly collect feedback from clients. 42% picked this kind of hand-wavy, casually, informally, in person, which means no. Like, let's be honest. Oh, hey, Bob, you like my services? Yeah, they're great. As if Bob, if someone who's particularly irate will let you know, but I think there's this tremendous observer effect where if you're asking in person, you're not going to get the real goods. So this brings us full circle back to NPS, which Jack did a great job explaining earlier. I'll briefly highlight again. You send a simple survey question. How likely are you to recommend my services to a friend or colleague? And someone picks a score between 0 and 10. You group 9s and 10s as promoters. I know that 8's not counting seems kind of unfair, but that is how the model works. You subtract everybody who picks 0 to 6, and you get the score that you can track over time, and of course have fun comparing to other industries that you don't want to be compared to. So we came in with 25 as the NPS for the legal profession. Jack had some fun highlighting, the other less than glamorous categories that ranks within. But one I thought I would call out is more this professional services category that could be a better apples-to-apples comparison. So investment firms, insurance carriers, also things that I don't think people are as excited to do as go buy a new iPhone or get something off of Amazon to drive those really crazy high NPS scores, but that are performing better and show evidence that if we do the right things in a professional services experience, there can be progress that's made. So in terms of those top drivers, overall cost of services, ease of understanding case expectations, bedside manner or personality, it's a tough one. I don't know how to change my personality, but I can try. And responsiveness. So the cost thing wasn't a key driver in deciding whether or not you needed a lawyer, but it's a much stronger driver in whether or not you would recommend a lawyer. It's a pain in the ass, I'm going to have to pay, fine, but did it come in at expectations? Setting and meeting client expectations is a key piece, the top driver and strongest. Also a tough one, right? A really tough place to make big adjustments. But the other three don't strike me as tough, like ease of understanding case expectations, bedside manner, and responsiveness. I feel like those are more approachable places to start to benefit the client experience and try different things and see if those results improve. And that brings us into setting and meeting client expectations as a section. So I think this is probably the meanest part of the report. Let's be honest, no one likes this, but it's also the most valuable. We asked a series of 8 questions, so 8 common interactions a client would have with their firm, and asked what mode of communication would you prefer or expect as part of working with a law firm. And just to very quickly review, those were in person, by phone, by email. We grouped together websites or online portals, and then have an other category, which ended up being pretty negligible in most cases as well. So I'll walk through each of these one by one, so you don't have to squint at the screen, and see where kind of the key things jump out. The first was, how do you expect to make appointments? And this top chart is lawyer responses. So overwhelmingly by email, with a secondary kind of sliver by in person. Interestingly, clients overwhelmingly expected to do that by phone. And I say expected because we need to keep in mind that clients can be educated too. Just how do you expect to do that with a law firm today? And they're expecting to call in and make an appointment. The second is explaining the facts and details of a situation. Overwhelmingly phone and email, like don't interrupt me, because interruptions are costly to lawyers. Complete opposite from clients on this one. Over 70% of clients, especially those going through a moment of crisis, want to walk in somewhere and tell someone their side of the story of what's going on. For better or worse, right? Like it's an imperfect behavior, but it is what's going through the client's mind as you're delivering something that might be perhaps quite different. The next point, learning about the legal aspects of a case. Again, overwhelmingly lawyers expected to do this by phone and email, and the strongest contingent of clients, over 55%, expected to do this in person. I need to know what's going on with my life or my business. I want to come in and have that explained to me in this key juncture, this really emotional moment on that end-to-end client journey we talked about. If you get kind of like a cold email, that can be a key juncture where you go from relief, someone's helping me, to frustration, this is not going well for me, it's not what I expected. A few more. Getting quick questions answered. Overwhelmingly, lawyers wanted to do that by email and perhaps by online portal. We saw a bit more of a break in wanting to do that by phone and email by clients. Getting status updates on a case. So lawyers overwhelmingly expected to make a phone call to provide that update to a client. 64% said they'd prefer to do that by phone. Interestingly, more clients preferred to get that by email and a few more by in-person meetings. Interesting. The next one, checking hours a lawyer is spending on the case. So I mentioned, they're not all disconnects. 40% of lawyers expected their clients to want to do that via an online portal, some way where you just check in, how are the hours piling up, and not get that sticker shock via the invoice that you're supposed to pay, but have that expectation set in advance. This goes crucially into that element as well of not overrunning on cost, on the cost coming in at what you expected as part of being one of the top drivers of NPS. And interestingly, it's one of the key areas where a lot of clients wanted to do that by an online portal as well. 26% of them reported wanting to be able to do that. The next one was signing, viewing, or delivering documents. Big preference for in-person followed by phone for lawyers, and a surprisingly big preference to want to do that in person among consumers as well, which surprised me a bit. It's probably not the way I'd want to do every single document interaction, but again, goes back to this idea of just because these are the expectations today doesn't mean we can't create opportunities to make it better for both sides. And our favorite one to beat to death at Clio for the third year in a row is making payments. How do lawyers expect to be paid? Come on down, bring me that check, come to the office. And the single biggest slice next to you expecting to do that in person for clients was being able to do that online, right? No surprise. Electronic payment methods and credit cards are consuming commerce in general, and we're seeing that same trend in legal continue to develop over time. But again, one of those areas where almost no lawyers pick that option. I know why, it's because most of them hate paying credit card fees. But if you can get paid versus not getting paid and make a dent versus that 15% you're losing on collection rate, like it's literally a no-brainer. And especially if you can get paid faster or on payment plans for clients that can't afford the total cost. Okay, everybody survived that? It was kind of uncomfortable in their chairs. I know, it's hard, but it's exactly the type of stuff you can use to create a competitive advantage, to transform, to evolve a little bit. And finally, this last element of perception versus reality, 68% of clients expect lawyers to be available outside their office. That's physically outside of their office location. Come meet me somewhere. I mentioned insurance carriers earlier. They're the ones kind of ruining it for everyone, right? They'll all travel to your office, renew your insurance, setting that expectation, and then someone having a different experience elsewhere. 59% of clients expect lawyers to be available outside of business hours, not their physical office location, but let's say outside of 9 to 5. So I need to work during the day, and then I need to deal with my personal legal matter, being an interesting disconnect. Jack mentioned this briefly as well. What about millennials, right? Don't we have all these trending narratives that they just want to do everything online and not meet anyone or talk to them? Nope. They're just as likely to want to come in person, especially in these key emotional moments. So this chart is showing us the percent of people who want to do these things in person, and is comparing people who are millennials, 18 to 34 in terms of age range, to older generations. And you can see that, for the most part, they're almost identical. And in some cases, millennials want to do more things in person with their lawyer than previous generations. Kind of surprising, unintuitive, if we think about doing everything through an app, but it speaks to that element of going through personal crisis and that client experience piece that we've talked about several times now. So what I'd like to do next is conclude with a few key lessons. I'll mention as well that the report is expansive. There's a lot of stuff in it as well that I didn't cover today because there's only so much you can walk people through in an hour-long presentation of data. So I encourage you to check out the other insights as well, and I'm happy to chat about those offline. But let's bring this thing home. What are the key lessons, and how can we turn our own discomfort that we're feeling looking at some of these facts into things that we're really proud of as progress that also matter for our businesses? So some of the key lessons for me. The reason I opened up with all of those examples of investment and innovation and companies trying new things is because we've often told ourselves this narrative in the legal technology space that change is coming soon. Well, it's not coming anymore, it's happening. That's a lot of dollars. $500 million into LegalZoom, $65 million of venture capital funding is not messing around. People are looking at this gap between the client experience and the legal service provider and recognizing there's an opportunity to evolve, but also to make a lot of money. So it's happening, right? No time like the present to get ahead of some of the changes that are happening. But it's happening in some interesting ways. So one of the more subtle takeaways from our legal trends report this year is that we've kind of looked at things from the perspective of, okay, lawyers have a bunch of misconceptions. They don't pay attention to their clients, and clients have a bunch of different preferences. But any evolutionary system is symbiotic. Client expectations are evolving and can be evolved as part of this as well if you have the right mindset and are focusing on educating them and setting the right expectations. So here's an interesting one. We asked 3 questions in our survey of consumers that are kind of forward-facing. And those were, how many of you agree that virtual lawyers are a good idea? How many of you prefer to never meet your lawyer in person? And how many of you agree that artificial intelligence and chatbots are useful in getting help? And what we have here are the percentage of total respondents that fit into 3 categories. The leftmost and green bar is general population. The blue bar are people who have had an issue in the past 2 years, a legal issue, I should say. And the gray bar are people who prefer to not hire lawyers at all. So unsurprisingly, people who prefer not to hire lawyers are the most up for agreeing with these statements. Virtual lawyering, preferring never meet their lawyer in person at all, and working with an AI or chatbot sort of interface. The thing I found really cool and interesting was people who have had a legal issue in the last 2 years were also more likely to want to try this stuff versus people who have not. So going through the process opens up your mind as a client about trying new stuff and perhaps even getting educated on the way the system works so that your expectations get reframed. I think this is one example of many that can be a very key takeaway from the Legal Trends report this year, and that is that clients have a set of expectations, and it's a starting point to understand what they are, but they don't stop there. They can be evolved. They can be educated. They can have expectations set that aren't just kind of making everything worse for you, too, but you can try experiments as well as part of that. The second concept I'll circle back to is this kind of market pyramid that I presented earlier. So the way this transformation with technology is going to take shape is going to be very uneven based on the market segment. And I think at some level, each and every one of you would know where your client base sits. You have some idea of like, how do I price my services? What segment of this market do I see myself tackling? And if you don't, now's a great time to start. Because the types of things that you start to change, the evolutions you go through, really highly depend on what part of this market your clients sit in. Are you going to go heavy into automation? Do you do transactional work that really needs to be available to a ton of people? That's the sort of stuff you start to focus on. Or are you looking for more of a kind of slightly more expensive mid-market approach where you want to really nail down those 2 key lifecycle elements of explaining the details of the case and learning about the legal aspects of the matter? Then double down on those and charge some rates that will allow you to have that in-person time with your clients. And that brings me to the second key takeaway, and that is, for me, in my kind of commentary on the report this year, is that conquering the divide, the gap between clients and lawyers, is really all about crossing this chasm and getting people on the side of feeling a sense of relief over a sense of frustration. And it's important to think about frustration in two categories: preventable and non-preventable. There are going to be times where things don't go the way that the client wants, and they're not preventable. It's kind of cost of doing business in legal. It's part of the way things work. But think about those moments that are preventable frustration. Things that didn't have to happen. They weren't kind of the legal outcome of the case. They were other aspects that could be managed much better. And try to turn those into simple moments of relief, possibly. And the way to get there is, of course, through understanding what's going through your client's mind and paying a lot more attention to it than perhaps we're trained to do over the years. And here's some key takeaways. I think in considering a lawyer, we heard it loud and clear that people worry that it's too expensive or not worth the value. Our Senior Vice President of Global Sales, Steven Silverback, is giving a talk in this room later today actually on selling based on value. And if you feel like you struggle to do that, you put out a price point and your clients complain about it because they're not perceiving value, I'd recommend going to that talk. It's kind of his experience in sales of really selling your own services like you would sell software or a good and service that I think is a really important opportunity. Too overwhelming, not worth the value, and multiple consultations. I'm going through this moment of crisis, and I have to go through all of this stuff that I really don't want to do right now. What are ways to turn that into maybe more of a moment of relief, vetting clients before they get in too deep in the inquiry process, and perhaps automating some of those things so that they're not so time-consuming and chewing into your utilization rate. On the side of working with a lawyer, it was pretty clear. I want to explain my issue in person. If that's one of those like immovable objects at the client's mind, let's optimize for that. You get to do that in person, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff you don't, because I can't have you in here every 5 minutes interrupting me while I'm trying to do my work. In last year's report, we presented the cost of knowledge workers and interruptions, and it can take a lot of time for you to dial back into something deep after getting unexpectedly interrupted. Same deal with the legal aspects of my case. Don't underestimate how your clients are feeling anxiety and really want to know how things work in a simple and clear fashion, and really want to do that in person. Responsiveness and convenience were huge, not applicable across the board, I know, but areas that are really important to the clients. And then finally, trying to set those expectations early of how much cost will come in on can, I think, be one of the strongest drivers in getting NPS scores up and earning those referrals for future business. I commented this already, but I picked out 3 examples of what people want to do in person. So obviously, learning about the legal aspects of the case and telling the lawyer the details of the matter were the 2 strongest disconnects in terms of where clients wanted to come in person. What if we shifted some of this time spent signing, viewing, sharing documents to other communication channels and then optimize more to what they really want to do in person, and perhaps what they're almost like superimposing on document review, which is actually, I'm kind of just concerned about the legal aspects of my case and want to use this as an opportunity to ask you. Some real opportunities to evolve there, and just because clients say they want to do all this stuff in person, maybe not the only way to think about getting it done. Okay. So in terms of, thanks for all the data insights, George. What do I do when I get back to my desk on Monday and make this real? The first thing to think about is this theme of evolution that I brought up several times. It doesn't happen in big seismic shifts, right? It happens in small steps. And that's how it's going to happen in this space. I don't think it's going to be one day where you show up and everything's different. It'll happen gradually over time. I think that's one key way of thinking about this. What are some of those small steps that I would recommend? There are 4 I'll walk through. Obviously, given on the heels of our product announcement, this is kind of convenient, but actually, when I wrote this recommendation, we hadn't built that feature yet. So you can use NPS or some other kind of satisfaction survey, but I don't think it's outside of the faculties of anyone in this room to ask their clients for feedback. That's something you could do today, or tomorrow, or Monday, if that's when you're flying back. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to simplify the inquiry process and allow clients to self-select before spending crucial time through the inquiry phase. I've mentioned this several times, but I think there is this opportunity to focus valuable and scarce in-person time on the key moments of the end-to-end client journey for maximum impact. And finally, I think there is a recurring opportunity to put all these technology tools to use to minimize in-person interruptions so as to allow you to focus them on those high-value in-person activities. If there's something people can do to self-help, you set up a client portal for them and they don't log in, like, keep at it. Keep educating them, right? You've got to kind of get them to change their behaviors to allow you to do your best work as well. And we see examples of that being possible. So those are 4 examples, but I think what's really powerful about this end-to-end client journey is that you can isolate and select individual moments on this journey, decide what it is for your clients, and get to work tackling specific improvements you want to make along the way. That could be unique to your practice, but it's inspired by this line of thinking. It's also a place where you can consult something like Clio's app directory and pick out the tools that are uniquely positioned to help you do that. If you decide you want to improve your intake or automation, through automation rather, you can focus on that. If you decide there's something more practice area specific that you want to do, there's typically an app that can help you do that so that you can focus on higher value activities. Many of those apps are here, right? So if you're feeling inspired, make sure to go check them out. There's a reason that all this ecosystem of products exist. And this is kind of bringing it full circle to the good news side of the story. Everyone else out there is still doing the same thing the same way they were before. And if there's nothing else you take from my talk today, consider and think about the fact that you could be veering away from the pack from doing what I think are some pretty straightforward and doable things. This isn't really transforming the way that you practice day to day or like doing something radical. It's literally like send someone an email survey. And we're in a space today where doing that is actually unique and stands above the crowd. And I think that's what the huge growth opportunity is to me, is time to start doing the things that many other businesses find success with, and you'll already be pulling ahead of the curve. And lastly, don't just take my word for it. So a really interesting resource that we've put up this year is a section of our website that we call Clio Customer Success Stories. My inspiration for a lot of these insights and feedback to you today isn't only from the data analysis, it's from talking to the customers we have who are making these innovations, trying them out, and finding success. And we've been fortunate enough to get many of them to tell their stories on record by video and in articles that you can access to get some inspiration. People who run small to mid-sized practices every day are trying a lot of this stuff and finding a ton of success. So I'd invite you to go check them out. There's an extensive library of videos and articles to kind of prove the point and show you what it's like to be doing this on a day-to-day basis. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their kind attention and time. Thank you. Jack ran super late, so we don't have a lot of time for a Q&A. Blame him. But I'll be sticking around and at the conference over the next couple of days and happy to follow up and connect with all of you. So thanks again.